Hi, welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, I'm a critic, consultant, and programmer based in Toronto, and this is The Other Thing I Do. This week, I'm delighted to welcome back Sophy Romvari, a writer and director who's been making evocative short films for more than a decade, building a personal aesthetic around themes of history, memory, and loss. Last fall, Sophy delivered her remarkable first feature, Blue Heron, and now it's rolling into theatrical release after months on the festival circuit and a string of critical awards. It is very good and very powerful, and you should see it. In her last appearance, Sophy and I talked about Kirsten Johnson's documentary Camera Person. For her return, Sophy picked another work of personal nonfiction, Martha Coolidge's remarkable Not a Pretty Picture. That film, made in 1975, combines a fictionalized reenactment of the director's own sexual assault with behind-the-scenes footage of Coolidge and her actors at work, attempting to articulate what it feels like to inhabit their characters and confronting their own feelings and perspectives about the material. Barely seen outside the festival circuit until a recent restoration, Not a Pretty Picture is a devastating experimental project that is, regrettably, still entirely relevant half a century later. You'll see. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Not a Pretty Picture was a film that was recommended to me by a friend, I believe, after she read my script early on, because I was writing the script from 2021-ish onward, and I was conceptualizing it basically since I was born. And we just were talking about the act of memory and recreating things that are real and then fictionalizing things, but also integration of documentary, all things that I was already really interested in. And so I watched the film from a research perspective, and I was really, really taken with how ahead of its time it was. Incredibly astute, very, very ahead of its time in terms of the form, the fact that this film was 50 years old, and also is a film that was not very accessible to the public. And I think the fact that it was restored in 2022 is incredible, but also it's quite devastating that it took that long for it to be accessible to people, because I think it's a very formative and could be a very formative film to many other filmmakers as well. Like I would put it in the same camp as, Watermelon Woman, other films that are often, by women that are hybridizing and taking the form into interesting places, using documentary and fiction and blending them. And so it was, I think, to my friend, a very obvious up Sophie's alley recommendation, and she was correct. Yeah.
So you saw it fairly recently as well.
Yeah, I saw it after the restoration, probably in that year when I was in development.
I think there was a screening at the Lightbox when I was there, but I wasn't able to get to it. And I had to catch up to it on the Criterion channel. And yeah, I'd never seen anything like it. There are other films like it, and there's this really fascinating interplay within the feminist cinema of the 1970s, specifically the American cinema. Molly Haskell had an essay on the Criterion disc that just rattles them off: Choice of 34 and Girlfriends, and it's unique among all of those as well, right? Because none of the other films has the metatextual slipperiness and what feels now like a really natural documentary device. Those shots of the camera pivoting to look at the real Coolidge watching the reenactment of her own assault. Now that's that's something you'll do. There's an NBC sitcom with Tracy Morgan and Daniel Radcliffe about a documentarian that uses those exact shots. It's just the context is for easy comedy, and watching them being employed for maximum emotional impact. I just found myself thinking how an audience must have responded to that 50 years ago. It would have been like being punched in the face. It's incredibly aggressive honesty.
For the audience that was able to see it.
Well, yeah, the handful. Supposedly it mostly just played women's film festivals, so it is even more kind of siloed away.
Yeah, which is disappointing because it also has a lot to say about the male perspective within this really, really devastating and collective experience that these women are trying to depict. And I think it's really interesting how the film opens with a very brazen text that this film is about the director's own experience of rape, and also the actor playing her has also had an experience of rape. And it doesn't allow the audience to have any distance from that reality right off the jump. It doesn't reveal it in some sort of twist. It doesn't slowly allow you to come to realize this is true. It says, this is what you're watching. And when you see these characters having our characters or people having emotional reactions, that is because they actually have personal experience with this. And so I think it's really bold and courageous filmmaking, and something that I think, as you said, whether or not it's conscious because people saw it or not, the impact of seeing a film that was made 50 years ago that is employing all these cinematic devices is really exceptional. And yeah, I think I took a lot from it. But also I took things from it in a way where I wanted to do things differently, or I wanted to do things similarly. But I found it really moving, regardless of how it inspired me or not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you wrote a piece for the CBC arts page that basically starts by saying that you had to learn that your memories were either false, missing, or misplaced in time. But what that tells me is that it's the moment where you can't trust your memory of something and you have to move past that.
Yeah.
Not a Pretty Picture is all about that. It's just so thick with questions and people trying to articulate their issues with the power dynamics and gender disparity and all of the tiny microaggressions that are macroaggressions because the camera is so close, and nobody had the language for it. Like, how do you even begin to pick up a camera and start saying these things without the subsequent 50 years? I mean, because of movies like that, we can have conversations about them now. But I found it just stunning that the actor who plays Curly, Jim Carrington, who was a friend of Coolidge's and finds himself method acting his way into some really horrible moments, which are right there on camera, and then not backing away from them, but also not understanding the mechanisms that got him there in the first place, and still trying. Like, really, those are the things that people would shut down from talking about now. And he's open and honest in his conflict.
Yeah.
And Coolidge, I mean, obviously structure plays a part in this, but Coolidge doesn't really dig into her own relationship to her memory and her own assault that she is reenacting, or she is having other people reenact, until the very, very end. And by kind of putting herself in the frame constantly while holding back her own responses, at least she won't articulate them. We can see them on her face.
Yeah.
But it's so gripping and so electric to see people try to be honest about something they don't fully understand.
And I think that what's so moving about the film is the attempt is being documented, and you can see it's not the polished finished product of what the attempt is, it's the attempt itself. And I think what's so striking about having it be compared directly with the fictional footage side by side is, at least for me, the fictional footage, as beautiful as it is and how like elegantly directed as it is, it kind of loses its power. It kind of loses its punch because you're seeing it in comparison to this very raw, very alive, footage that feels, in a way, more. The performances feel more real, and both are performances, though. So I wouldn't even say it's really doc versus fiction. It's just a different context, and all the trappings of fiction. When you strip that away, you do get these really profound performances when they're just trying to focus on the emotions. And I think that the film is really also about the limitations of fiction and limitations of recreation. And I think about that a lot in my own work.
There is a sense too that some of the recreations are more raw than others. I mean, the fact that the assault happens in a loft, which is clearly like in the middle of being either renovated or destroyed, it's hard to tell, but the passage between two rooms is a hole with the word hole written on it. And that's okay. I mean, it's almost like a black box level of storytelling, but then you've got other recreations which are in dorm rooms and cars and common spaces, halls where people are singing to an audience. Having the assault happen someplace that is completely aesthetically different too and removed from the world makes it feel simultaneously more metatextual because we're watching actors act in a rehearsal space effectively, but also I can absolutely understand that that's how it makes sense to Coolidge to shoot it as someplace where there is nothing. There's no humanity. There's no outside world at all. And this is a place people go to enable horrible things. Like she's brought there to this space in her memory for this reason and that reason alone.
But both are recreations. Just one is done with a more production design and more of a fictional of what we understand to be fiction filmmaking, but both are essentially recreations and performance. And I think it's to have those two things juxtaposed side by side is a very different experience than if it was just about the rehearsal space or just about the fictional world that she recreates. And I think it's the secret is within the juxtaposition between those two things. And I found that to be really, really powerful and also, yeah, very elegant in terms of what it's trying to say about filmmaking as well, and depicting violence on screen and depicting your own personal experience on screen. And so she's doing so many different things um, with the camera visually and with her own direction. And it can be easy to um, strip that back when you see these very raw scenes, but it's a very intelligently directed and edited film.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the editing specifically because the slipperiness of reality and fiction and or at least documentary and reenactment is so crucial. The blackouts, the way that it's just it's not fancy in any way. A scene ends and then we're back in the real world watching Coolidge and her actors. And then it switches to the scene that they're sort of talking around, and then there's a reenactment of that, and then there's a discussion. And the rhythms that it sets up are almost reassuring because it gives the audience a chance to breathe, except that the conversations in the documentary realm are even more fraught and tense, right? They're talking about traumas that have already happened and are about to be reenacted. And so you can never really breathe. You start getting a different tension, and that waveform between the two it just continues through the entire film, and it's just such a great use of the limitations of the tech at the time, where really all you can do is a blackout. There's no, like, this isn't a fancy project, and the rawness is part of it. But once I realized I was kind of a captive of this rhythm, it just doesn't let you breathe. It doesn't give you any safe space because even if there's no immediate threat, they're talking about how awful it was to enact it, and so your sympathies just keep shifting. It's again, Haskell wrote about it in her essay, and it's a great essay that I recommend everybody read. There is no clear villain. I mean, there are people who are awful, clearly, but then by seeing the actor immediately try to wrestle with that, it gives the fictionalized villains, the rapists specifically, but also some of the girls who just don't know how to behave afterwards and become villains themselves, attacking the young Martha and Anne. The tension there is that we need them to be human beings, or rather the movie makes them human beings instead of monsters by having the people playing them try to understand why they do the things they do. And that's just so, it's incredibly mature and empathetic filmmaking, but it's also just confrontational in a way that I don't think anything had been at that point in time.
Yeah. I think the film really makes me think about the historical way in which women tend to be more confrontational in the work that they make from a personal perspective, and how often that is belittled as just simply personal, and that there isn't a creative element or something involved when you make personal work, or can't you just write fiction, or this kind of um, patronizing response that I've received, but I know every woman who's made a personal film has received, of why make your film about yourself, or it's navel gazing, or these kinds of things. But I think there is a real history of confrontation of society that occurs in films, oftentimes that are by women, and I wonder why that is, and why is it that it's belittled? Because obviously men historically have made way more films, directed way more films, and it seems to be that there is more of a shield of fiction, but everyone's work is coming from a personal place ultimately. But why is it that women are making work historically, like you said, since the 50s, 60s, 70s, that is more confrontational and is more personal? And I think that when I was making my thesis film and I was studying all these films, I think it became very evident to me that this is a historical movement that I'm just a part of contributing to, and it makes me think a lot about why it is that these films are put into such different contexts, because they are very much directed, very much formally driven works that people just oftentimes subjugate into different categories than fictional films that are by men. Yeah.
I assume it's just because the inevitability of a woman making a film about elements of her own existence is that patriarchy is going to be involved in there somewhere, and the men who are watching that would really rather not be reminded that they're the villains in someone else's story, as like the most basic and banal reading. But I can absolutely see people recoiling from this, because not only is, you've got Curly as a monster, but you've also got Jim Carrington wrestling with it and showing people that it is possible for men to deal with those issues, or at least to articulate them and try to confront them. And while I don't think the film is about Jim Carrington's evolution as a person, it's an essential element of the story. And Coolidge being willing to hear him out and asking him to do this in the first place, and then being interested in what it makes him feel as an actor and a human being, as opposed to just be Curly, be a monster, and then we won't talk about that. It's so open-hearted in a way that it did not need to be. And then subsequently, all the films that Coolidge makes are, even the broader comedies, are interested in people and listening to why they do things, and looking for reasons and choices. And it's absurd to me that this is the same person who made Real Genius 10 years later, because that's a polished studio picture, and it's politically aware, and it's we screened it in the Disreputables because it was this great example of using the genre of comedy to make comments about the mission creep of the Reagan Revolution, and the use of university students as basically free labor for the military industrial complex and everything else that would matter 40 years later. But she is the same person, and she is like acutely aware of the relationship between people with power and people without power. It's just that it pivots in a different direction in her, quote unquote, lighter films.
Right, but that's because she's a director.
Oh yeah.
And she's, I think that's what I mean about sometimes personal films being put into these boxes of, well, it's sometimes people think that making a personal film is somehow easier, because you're not inventing something. But of course, there's so much invention that goes on, and so much personal work that is fictional. It's maybe just not as evident that the work is personal because of metaphor. I find that, I just find historically it's interesting that there's just so many films that are by women that are more confrontational about, society, which involves themselves. But I think that it's, I think also historically, obviously, women have not always had as many resources. So that comes with a limitation of what stories are able to be told. And that's part of what I was also interested in studying. But those limitations create such interesting work and such relevant work. The fact that this film, from 50 years ago is so relevant now, I think is very telling and very very fascinating to me. Yeah.
Hey, it's Norm, interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my newsletter about physical media, culture, and the odd streaming project. Last week, I wrote about Criterion's absolutely gorgeous 4K edition of Ernst Lubitsch's Trouble in Paradise, and of course there was Friday's What's Worth Watching dispatch for paid subscribers. Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io or find a link in the Semcast Blue Sky account. You like reading about movies? I like writing about them. Come check it out. And the intersection between what Coolidge does in this film and what you do, not just in Blue Heron, but in your shorts as well, and sort of engage yourself as an active participant in the telling of your own history, I guess, if that doesn't sound too, tortured. You are asking the audience to both identify with you and watch you from a distance as you tell these stories, as you recreate these stories or live them for the first time, in something like still processing, where we're right alongside you through all of that. And with Blue Heron, there's more of it's not a disconnect exactly, but the fact that you're making a period piece about a younger version of this, well, not a younger version of yourself even, but a younger version of this story or an earlier point in history, creates an entire world that has to be built and has to be engineered into being. So, or what I want to ask is, when you see something like Not a Pretty Picture, does that give you a sense of what's possible or a sense of what can be built on? Or does your own process take you completely in the other direction for something like Blue Heron?
Mhm. I think that's, yeah, what I was trying to articulate earlier is that I think seeing this film, but also
Mm-hmm.
seeing many other films, when I was making still processing, I did a lot of research. You learn as much from watching other films for what you do want to do, for also what you don't want to do. And that has nothing to do with my love of the work. It's just what I'm trying to do might be different. And I think what this film in particular, Not a Pretty Picture, did help me solidify my decision in was that I did not want to cross cut in my film between time periods or even between two modes or anything. I wanted there to be a very distinct bifurcation in the film. And there was several films I watched that do this cross-cutting, which I think is obviously a tried and tested cinematic tool. But I knew that I really wanted to compare these two halves side by side and have there be a jump in this timeline. And so I think that's where in watching Not a Pretty Picture, I felt the power of it, but I also felt something, the disconnect between those two. It works for that film, but I knew that for my film, I wanted to try something different, which I, of course, did not know if it would be effective or not, until I made the film, until other people saw the film. And there's many films that have bifurcations, and I'm drawn to many films that do have that structure because I think it's maybe more how my mind works is I learn about something with as much depth as possible, and then I look at it from my present perspective. It's not so much going back and forth. And I find filmmaking is a really great tool for that. And as you mentioned, like a lot of my other films are also about trying to piece together the past from a present day perspective. And I really wanted to have that creative distance in this film where I'm not present in the film. I had done that in my previous work, and it was very integral to my evolution as a filmmaker and as a person, but I was completely opposite of what I wanted to do with this film. So all of the things I did leading up to Blue Heron were just additive to my evolution as an artist who is trying to get at something, and I couldn't get at it properly until I made this film, I think. And they're all individual, like all the shorts are their own individual thing, but I can see now watching them back because I recently had a little mini retrospective at a festival, and I watched all my shorts, and I could really see that I was trying to get at something, but I couldn't quite get there. And I was trying to formulate like a language, but I just wasn't quite ready to um, speak that language fluently. And then Blue Heron is, for me, the most articulate version of what I've been trying to say this whole time. And I feel now that it closes a bit of a chapter in my life and as an artist. And I said it visually how I wanted to say it, but also formally how I wanted to say it. And I feel I needed to do all those things to get to this point. Um, and seeing other films do things similarly or differently also contribute to that massively.
I absolutely see that. And it's funny because the thing that I like about the shorts is that they are 90% of the way to saying something. And that last 10% is the thing that I find so compelling about your work in the short form, because it ends before the articulation. And in retrospect, you're absolutely, I agree completely. I mean, it's your work. Of course, I'm going to agree with your interpretation of it. But with Blue Heron, it snaps together. It lands in a way that the others didn't have to, because they were elliptical and like short stories versus novels. You can do more with the vibe. As much as I hate the concept of vibe cinema, you can absolutely bring people to a place of wanting the catharsis but not getting it. Whereas in Blue Heron, yeah, you just took that last step. And narratively, I mean, not creatively, I think the creative line is a straight line here, but yeah, it feels like a breakthrough in terms of narrative and also a closing of the book, as you say. But what I also found fascinating about it is that the device of I'll talk around this. The devices you employ require you to have different versions of characters in different time periods and ages and attitudes. And as with anyone who experiences the sort of thing that Blue Heron is about, which I'm protecting for listeners, sorry guys, you are a different person before and after something like this.
Mm.
And the characters have to be distinguishably different. And with age, it's one thing, but there's also a manner and tone that comes across. So I wanted to ask the question that no one asks Coolidge in the Criterion package: how do you choose the people to play these characters who you know inside and out, and who you need to be something for yourself as well as for the film? How complex is that process, and how long does it take to land?
I would say it's almost the most important part of the process was the casting, and it was a very delicate and thorough process that took about a year, or I had about a year because I was waiting to hear back from Telefilm. But it makes a huge difference, especially when you're casting a family. It's very integral. So it wasn't so much like, how do I cast my family? I was very invested in making sure that the family felt authentic, and not just in appearance, but also in chemistry. And it comes down to sort of pairs, because we have the parents who were cast out of Hungary by a Hungarian casting director, and they had to have a really believable history between them in chemistry, and that had to be where everything came from, and to sell this family as a family. And then the two little boys were cast together as a duo, and they're not brothers, obviously, but or some people think they're actually twins. But I cast them because they had a playfulness between them in the casting sessions that I was holding in parks, and having them just play card games and hide and seek, and they developed a rapport, and so much of their rehearsal was just me sending them on play dates, like go play with water guns, go play video games, and they developed their own world together. Um, and then Jeremy and Sasha were a little bit more like isolated, because that's how their characters are in the film. And then the adult Sasha and younger Sasha, once they met, they bonded as well. And so it was a lot to do with like bonding the actors and developing relationships that were outside of the context of the film. But then also every character and every actor did bring a uniquely personal element to the film, or a uniquely personal connection, I would say. And Edic, who plays Jeremy, is a street cast actor, and he's had never acted before, and he did have a really, really almost cosmically similar life experience. And he was really motivated to do the film because he found that it could be actually a cathartic experience for him to interrogate his own experiences through a fictional lens. So we were all kind of doing it. It wasn't just me, which lifts the weight and the burden of it just being about my own experiences. Like Amy, who plays adult Sasha, I think the character is really me plus Amy plus adult Sasha. And I see all of those elements in the performance. And that's what makes me so proud of her and of her performance is she's really truly embodying like a level of like empathy that is quite unique as an actor. Because she was given in many ways the most difficult role because she's the one who's trying to bridge the gap between past and present, but she doesn't have um, the same access to dialogue and catharsis until she has that moment with the letter. So she's really listening and interrogating, but we're having to empathize through her in a really subtle way. So it's a subtle performance. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just so immediately absorbing. The film just sort of pulls me. Well, my experience of it was to just see what you were doing, sort of try to figure out what the game was, and then realize the game doesn't actually matter. There is just the observation. You just watch them exist, and then the story goes where it goes. But it's so intimate. I'm thinking about, for comparisons, just for the lack of anything better, I think about Joanna Hugg's early films or After Sun, what Charlotte Wells does with memory and having sort of an avatar for herself in those interstitials.
Interesting that it's all women.
Well, I mean, but of course it is, right?
I find that genuinely interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't think men do it in the same way. I don't think men have access to their memories in the same way because of, and again, generalizing massively,
Yes.
but we're all taught to be, the heroes of our own stories. And so there isn't as much introspection in the retrospection. We don't wonder in the same way, I think, that a lot of female filmmakers do what we might have done differently.
Mm.
The best example, rather, that I can think of is probably Au revoir les enfants, where Louis Malle adds a moment that didn't happen to specifically, it's just a gesture, it's just a look. He spoke of it in interviews. The thing that happens to his representative character didn't happen.
Yeah.
But it's an expression of guilt that is still with him decades later. And the movie is basically his attempt to take blame for something that is a collective action that he had no real power in.
Sorry, I think it's also just how society reads the work, though, because I think there's very obvious examples of filmmakers who are men who make personal work. It's just not always, that's not like the main point that we think of when we think of the work. Like I think of like Tarkovsky's Mirror, which I think is an incredibly personal film and deeply about his own childhood and evidently, and something that I thought about or watched when I was developing this film. And then also a more recent example is like Pedro Almodovar's Pain and Glory, also recreating elements of his childhood and life and through the act of filmmaking. And so there's many, many examples. It's just not always what we prioritize when we talk about the work, I think. Um, but I think, yeah, I think that's just it's interesting to me, and I'm so inspired by so many filmmakers who are men, obviously. I mean, Tree of Life is also a great example, and people do know or talk about that film as a personal work, but it's not. I don't think it's the main thing people talk about. It's the cinematography, it's the direction, it's the form, really. Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's funny. I think I've maybe mythologized those filmmakers enough to that I don't put them in the same box as something small and intimate because their films are they take up so much landscape in my mind. But I do, yeah, I remember when I wrote my Tree of Life review, it was the whole thing was about how happy I was to see Malick finally acknowledge that his movies are always personal.
Best personal films is Steven Spielberg.
Yep, absolutely. The Fablemans is sort of the best possible example because it's the first time he steps up and owns himself. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, Munich is and War of the Worlds are this incredible double bill about how he felt after 9/11 and the searching he did to understand the nature of terror and reprisal. And they come out in very different ways. But I think the fact that they exist 6 months apart from each other and 4 years down the road from the incident are, like, it's inarguable that those are connected by his own feelings of terror at being on the other side of the country and not being able to act.
Yeah. Or even just more familial and personal nature is like Close Encounters. And this repeated theme in all of his work about a parent leaving and about his parent separation, which we only come to really understand in The Fabelmans, but it's in so many of his films as the single parent household and his feelings about that, which I think is incredibly personal. And he's like the biggest, most blockbuster driven filmmaker we have. So I like to think of him often as an example as he's a personal filmmaker, but it's not what we think about when we think about his work. And it's interesting that he made Fablemans at the end of his career. Well, hopefully not the end, but yeah.
Later in life. It's one of those things where I think he had to be older to make it the way he did,
Yeah.
with the confidence he had. But there's an interview with him for the 40th anniversary of E.T. where he discussed it and said that E.T. only exists because he had been working on another Alien movie with post Close Encounters, more of a horror film. I think it was called Night Skies. And he'd also been developing what became the Fabelmans, but he couldn't get anybody to back him because, even after making two massive hits, this is before Raiders, he couldn't interest people in a personal project or a small project. Everybody wanted him to make another studio hit. But then he said the thing that created E.T. is that he started wondering what would happen if one of the aliens from Night Skies blundered into that family.
Yeah.
And it informs, like, it is, those weird, tender moments of a kid needing a role model or a friend, and what Dee Wallace is doing as someone who's had her world ripped away from her and is just not dealing with it very well, but putting on a brave face for her kids. Yeah, it's incredibly sensitive, emotional filmmaking about a broken family.
Yeah. And I think that that's really the line for me that I was trying to push past with Blue Heron, is how to make a personal film that really opens the world up to the audience and to invite people in. And I think I was always trying to do with that with my shorts as well. But I think with the fictional context and the just all of the pieces of the filmmaking in Blue Heron were targeted toward the specificity of my experience, but also wanting to invite people in. And I think I didn't realize until people started to watch the film just how many avenues of entry there were, because people have come to me who have experienced something very similar to the character of Jeremy, or they really relate to having had a sibling like Jeremy, or their parents who had children of the similar nature. And so there's all these different avenues of entry, and I think ultimately I do make films that I want people to be able to access, and they're not definitely not just for me. If anything, they're for my parents, but they're not just for my parents either. I want people to be able to resonate with the work and to feel catharsis or representation, because it's very much a communal experience. And I think that's always my goal, is to find a way to connect through my personal experiences, but have other people feel represented. And just yesterday, actually, I got an email from someone in Barcelona who said that they grew up with oppositional defiant disorder, which is what is labeled in the film as the character's diagnosis, and how this film so represented their experience in a way that they were so moved by. And so it felt so cathartic to them to see it represented and to see the parents dealing with this so sensitively. And so they were they felt represented. But within like an hour, I received an email from someone who is from Vancouver, who was a Hungarian immigrant in 1985 and grew up on Vancouver Island and had the same Volvo and grew up with parents speaking broken Hungarian and English. And so I happened to hear from two completely different people across the world who felt that the film represented some element of their childhood. And I thought that was such a beautiful like validation of the film reaching these far corners of people's experiences, even though so vastly different, but combined into this one thing. And I thought, that's kind of, as a filmmaker, I don't know what else you could ask for.
My thanks to Sophy Romvari, whose marvelous first feature, Blue Heron, is now playing at Film Forum in New York and rolling out across the US and Canada in the weeks to come. Check out blueheron.film for locations, showtimes, and tickets. And if you're in Toronto, you can catch Sophy in conversation with David Cronenberg after the 7 p.m. show this Friday, April 24th at the Cineplex Varsity Cinemas. Thanks also to Winnie Wong. She knows what she did. You can find Sophy on Instagram at Sophy Romvari, all one word, and you can find Not a Pretty Picture on Blu-ray and DVD in the Criterion Collection. It's also streaming on the Criterion Channel in the US and Canada, and available to rent or buy on various VOD services across North America. You can find me on Blue Sky at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhep.com/semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 40 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps. It truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, get all the boosters. I'll see you next week.